actually supposed to be introducing this panel, but I am Fran Marie Kennedy. I am of the Aspen Institute, and I have known Dan Glickman for a very long time, and he's going to moderate this extraordinary panel of many, many wonderful people who are going to answer the question, how do we feed 9 billion people? Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Fran Marie. So the topic is actually how we nourish 9 billion people.
Thank you.
And I think that's important because it relates to the issue of not only the quantity of food, but the quality of food. So I'm going to make a couple just quick opening remarks in terms of facts, and turn it over to each of the folks, a very distinguished group of people. They represent different parts of this, of the food chain, I would say, the food and nutrition chain in the world. But one is that we have about 850 million people who go hungry every night in the world. We even have a serious problem in the United States with about 1 out of 7 people accessing the SNAP program. And of course that does provide food, and America is fortunate to have one of the most aggressive food assistance programs in the world. But we have about 2 billion people in the world who are characterized as food insecure. Many of those are smallholder farmers, women farmers, big part of this group. Much of that relates to poverty and a situation where they are kind of stuck in perpetual poverty, and it impacts their diets. We're going to need to grow between 70% to 100% more food in the next 25 to 30 years to meet the demand of a growth of population, about 2 billion people more, and a growth of incomes in India and China and other places where people are living better and want to eat better, and their food volumes and the nutritional intake are going to reflect that, and how to do that in a way that's consistent with sustainable agriculture. So we don't rip up the soil, we don't rip up the forests, and we deal with this remarkable issue of water and water conservation. Water is one of the most serious issues affecting agriculture today. Political stability is affected by the developing world not having a stable food supply, so the challenges are very great. At the same time, I think it's worth reflecting, in the last 100 years, we have made remarkable progress in this area. Life expectancy is up worldwide. Fewer people are subject to famines than they were before. Technology has moved agriculture ahead remarkably. And notwithstanding the great challenges we have, I think we should reflect on the fact that many things in terms of the green revolution, of agriculture research, of the NGO world, the NGO community, of the actions of the United States of America, where we've been one of the leaders in the world over the years. I mean, it has improved the situation. But we have to deal with the fact that the problems are still severe, and when you top off climate change and climate variability, this makes producing food much, much more difficult to deal with. So we have 5 great, really great leaders in this subject today, and I'm not going to introduce each one of them. I'm going to, because you all have the bios, but I'm going to start with Bonnie McClafferty. Bonnie is the Director of Agriculture for GAIN. GAIN is an organization based in Geneva and in the United States that's focused on helping people deal with a nutritious diet in this period of uncertainty in terms of food production. So Bonnie, if you were looking at this problem and looking at the future, we know kind of what the problems are. Mm-hmm. What are you doing on the ground that is making a difference in this area?
Good question,
Yeah.
Dan, thank you. So just a little bit more about GAIN so people know. GAIN was founded about 10 years ago, recognizing that nutrition sat in many different organizations. It sat in the UN under WFP, it sat under WHO a bit, it was under FAO. So this is a single organization that was saying, projecting forward, saying, you know, not only do we need new technologies where there's plenty of investment, but it's this last mile of getting foods into the mouths of babies that we weren't necessarily addressing. So looking into the future, how are you going to do that? It takes public investment, but very much private sector. How do we get the scale and the reach and the sustainability is to really look at all the partners at the table. And so we've been projecting these problems for quite some time. Initially, GAIN started to address that through what was a proven intervention, large-scale food fortification. So knowing that iodized salts, fortified wheat flour, these are touching all populations, or most of the population. So they use vehicles to put fortificants in. They brought me on in agriculture about 3 years ago, recognizing, first of all, a lot of the undernourished are farmers, and that we weren't necessarily reaching them with these products, but also that the agricultural food system is where we're starting with nutrition. And that, in fact, you can augment the nutritional quality of foods in agriculture by better seeds, nutrient-rich, micronutrient-rich fertilizers, but you can also lose nutrients. Is what we're seeing is the food system isn't paying attention to the quality of food. So what we're doing is we're actually losing nutrients in the food system through some of our current practices. So I'm glad you mentioned all the numbers. I was going to talk about sort of the prevalence of malnutrition, but these numbers are mind-boggling, right? So 840 million people, what is that? The United States, what's the population of the United States?
350, 340.
340? Okay, so everyone in the United States being, like, not enough food, and then add on another third, right? Let's get our head around this. 2 billion people don't have micronutrients, adequate micronutrients in their diet. That means children's brains aren't developing, immune systems are shattered. So, you know, you've got an enormous mortality challenge when children don't have immune systems and they can't fight infection. You'll find that malnutrition is the underlying cause of most mortality in children under 5 in the developing world. It's staggering. So I think if I'd like to just jump to the fact that we at GAIN don't see that there's any one actor in this. As our executive director would say.
So there's no one silver bullet either?
There's no one silver bullet. I mean, we would say you got to get all shots on goal. You know, again, you have an enormous global burden. And so it takes public investment. It takes the CSO, the civil society the civil society touch the hungry, like no one touches the hungry. The public sector investment in research and universities have incredible brain trust around this. But we have to recognize the role of the private sector, and I think we have to be very careful when we think the private sector is only multinational corporations. Food is moving through small and medium-scale businesses. And I'm an agronomist. I've been working with farmer organizations for 2 decades. Farmers are private sector. So let's just be really clear when we paint the private sector. The private sector are all of the actors in the food system, and all of them have a role to play, and we can innovate and understand the barriers for each one of them.
So are you optimistic, given the nature of the problem and what you see on the ground?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first of all, we have the solutions. Malnutrition is something we actually have solutions for. And there are plenty of diseases we don't, right?
Yeah.
And this is something where it's a system, and I like using this word, food system, because it's not just agriculture's responsibility to fix, it's not just public health's responsibility to fix, it's the food system, because people aren't sourcing, they're not eating nutrients, they're eating diets.
Yeah.
And we got to be careful with
Okay,
that.
and I want to come back to you later on because you have a great relationship with a U.S. government effort called Feed the Future,
Yes,
which
yes.
has been very remarkable. But I want to go to Toni. So Toni is an amazing person, and Toni runs the Middle East project, the Aspen Institute, but more significantly, she was a senior political leader in the Department of State for many years. She worked on the Hill for the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So you can see this problem in the context of foreign relations, America's role in the world. How do you see us solving this problem?
So Dan, I think that's a good question, and I want to pick up on a couple of comments that Bonnie said. I think the way you both are framing it, there's an enormity of a problem, but we also have to look at this as a broader ecosystem. I'd like to suggest we need a paradigm shift. For me, I look at the food security issue, of which I'm privileged to work with Dan Glickman at the Aspen Institute on a food security initiative that is multi-program collaboration, and it is for a reason. These are issues that cut across multiple lines when you look at the whole the enormity of food security, climate change, the environment, nutrition, the multiplicity of actors. But we need a paradigm shift. Food security needs to be looked at in the context of our national security. And that means our national security interest in terms of feeding and dealing with food insecurity in America, because let there be no mistake, Americans need this broad population that is underserved. There is the social unrest, the lack of education, those who have jobs but are struggling with poor nutrition diets, and I know Ron will speak to this issue in a little while. For me, I'm informed by the uprisings and the instability in the Middle East. National security, and when you address food security and look at it with multiple stakeholder approach, you invest in security. You invest in those smallholder stakeholders. You invest in the SMEs. That's the essence of Benjamin Franklin, the Leather Apron Society, and the legacy of America's story. But we can't do this. We need leadership, and we need to think outside the box, and we need to run outside the box. We need to lash up the technology that you addressed and touched on, the science, the breakthroughs of science, but we need to reach a common agenda, and we need to be willing, as we look at the conclusion of the Millennium Development Goals and look at the new iteration of the Sustainable Development Goals that the upcoming UN General Assembly will be addressing. I'm here to say I don't think our multilateral approach, whether it's our own government's approach, which is doing some good things, but we need leadership of a whole of government approach and a new multilateral institutional approach.
So there's no, in one respect, the U.S. government does pretty well because we provide about half the food aid in the world to the hungry, but that's usually bulk food aid that's done to deal with crises, humanitarian disasters, that kind of thing. But it strikes me what you're saying is we got to go much further than that. We will provide the assistance when there's a humanitarian disaster.
There's no question.
But the question is
we need to go further and farther, and we need to be deeper in terms of the innovation and creating pipelines to address what's the actionable agenda on this ecosystem that you addressed, Bonnie, on the ground. That we have best practices in Africa that relates to North Africa that's extrapolated to the Gulf, which is a player in this food security ecosystem.
And it is worth noting that in Tunisia and in Egypt, the disturbances and the political instability started with bread riots
and the mismanagement of water. The drought issue in Syria was the early indicator of the unrest, which we are now seeing is an enormous national security issue for us.
So Derek YACH has got so many titles and degrees, I wouldn't know where to start, but you know, he's a health expert, a nutrition expert. He was a leader in the World Health Organization. He was at Pepsi. How many years were you at Pepsi? 5 years, in charge of what, their health and sustainability? I don't remember exactly what your title was.
I don't know. Bit of agriculture.
But anyway, your knowledge of health and nutrition are probably unequaled in terms of your practical experience and your regulatory experience. So what do you think is the next step? Where do we go from here, now knowing what the problem is?
Yeah, I think if I took some of the insights I've gained from different sectors, I think it gives a hint to where we might be doing better. The first is in the UN and governmental system, where clearly policy matters, as you know so well. And yet we still have a malalignment between the roles and functions of agriculture and those of health and nutrition. It starts at the level of the UN, where Food and Agriculture Organization and WHO couldn't answer what I think is a critical question: what should the agricultural supply look like long-term to meet the optimal nutritional needs of all? And how far off are we in producing what we really need to do, both to meet the needs of the poorest countries, but also need to address the needs of emerging economies? If we knew that, I think it would stimulate enormous investment in the side of where the gaps are and actually start realizing that demand reduction is needed on, for example, meat and livestock consumption in many parts of the world. The second, I think I learned certainly being in PepsiCo, and not just the company alone, but through the World Economic Forum's effort on Grow Africa, where they brought together food companies, agricultural companies, governments, to pragmatically address how we can improve long-term agricultural need. And the big thing that came through from the beginning was that you have to address 3 axes simultaneously. Environment, where you so well spelled out, the water crisis is going to change everything. We are growing things in places which will not be able to grow things in future. Some parts of the world are blessed with being in the right geography. We need to ensure they don't become protectionist over the long term, because they need to be seen as the great exporters. There are some countries which are not blessed with that, and as you said, the Middle East, parts of Africa are vulnerable. So what the World Economic Forum did, and I would like to see accelerate, is play to the real strengths of agricultural and food companies, using both their supply chains, their R&D capability, their knowledge about better infrastructure, to actually be accelerating investment, particularly in Africa. And why do I say Africa? Most of the experts would say that as a continent, it has the lowest output, 1 ton per hectare, compared to the rest of the world where it's 2, 3, 4, 5, up, higher up. So if we're looking to meet 9 billion people, the role of African agriculture is going to be extremely decisive, not just for Africa, but for the rest of the world. And the last point, I'm now with a group which goes from the macro down to the personal. And I'd like to remind people that the decision you make in a restaurant or when you go to the shop actually has got global implications. What you purchase has ramifications throughout the food system. If you stick to a heavy meat, dairy-based product area, you're going to suck in a lot of resources which long-term are going to be needed in the rest of the world to provide adequate grains. These may seem tenuous relationships, but they're increasingly known and spelt out. So demand reduction to reduce obesity in the developed and the increasing emerging economies actually is going to release food into the rest of the world where the needs are as high as you mentioned. The second is food waste. People often neglect the fact that the levels of food waste in agriculture are huge. We lose maybe 30 to 40% of our produce from the farmer to getting it to market in many developing countries. Many in this country, and many of us would be guilty of it, would be wasting it post-purchase, a large amount.
About the same percentage, about 30% here in the U.S.
And wasted food is wasted land. It's wasted productive land. It's wasted food which could be going elsewhere. There's a lot of innovation which could be done about addressing waste, and some of the groups I'm with are looking at that in detail.
And just quickly, are there any success stories out there? Because we've talked, Bonnie and I have talked a little bit about how we share things, and I'm going to ask Josh about this later on, but how we should share things that are actually happening that are good out there in the nutrition world or in the other worlds that you've been talking about.
Well, I've seen some examples of, say, shifting consumption trends. A good example is with our group out of South Africa, where they give a large discount for healthy foods. And in the largest study, by 100-fold, they looked at 300,000 people over a few years who get a 25% discount at the major retailers for healthy food. The consumption trends went up for healthy food, they went down for unhealthier foods. And importantly, those changes were associated with big shifts, positive shifts, in saving land, water, and greenhouse gases. And you can work out how that happens. That's a signal that healthy diets are more sustainable diets. And the intimate link between the two is something we're going to have to live with down the line. I think the Grow Africa is a spectacular example of leadership coming from the head of state of Tanzania, of Kenya, of many African countries, creating corridors for investment in parts of the continent where the Unilevers and the agricultural companies and others can then come in and actually start increasing growth. But it required the policy to be right in the first place, the policy to incent industry to come in and grow the right stuff. And I would say that is one of the big macro examples we have.
Okay, so shifting, not totally, a little bit domestically. Ron, you run one of the largest food retailers in the United States. In fact, you're right across the street from the Aspen Institute on 19th Street. You have a store there. I stop there almost every morning.
We're glad
Is
to
that
hear
good?
Dan.
Yeah, okay. Any event, you have a competitor that's right next to you, but I will
You're not
usually
in
go.
there, right?
I'd say 9 times out of 10 I'll stop in your store.
Okay,
So,
we got cameras, so we
yeah,
can
well,
check
I like
on
to
this.
just make sure the competition, what they're doing. You know, I'm really working for you on the side. But, okay, so here you have this great company. You've been focusing on health, nutrition, sustainability, food waste. You're also a corporate executive that feels the imperative to engage, not just because you can put it on an annual report that you're socially responsible, but it actually impacts your company as well. I want you, if you might talk a little bit about why you're doing what you're doing and how you may see this helping the bigger picture here.
Sure. I'll provide some perspective as a player in the private economy, and some perspective, quite frankly, on domestic food insecurity, because we've been talking about international food insecurity. I'll start and say that I run Panera Bread. Panera Bread is a $5 billion company, 80,000 employees, 8 million customers a week. And, you know, we have traditionally been involved in CSR activities. We give somewhere in the range of $100 million a year in product and in cash. And one of the things that I began to feel as I watched us do this was the disconnection, quite frankly, between what we did and writing a check in ourselves. And it seemed so clear to me that we wanted to figure out how we actually could use our own arms and legs and actually make a difference at something we did. And one of the things I felt for some time as a corporate leader is we have a responsibility to the broader society. If we don't care for the society, if all we view is the society as a place to extract profit, there's nothing left ultimately. And so we began to play with it, and we began to learn about food insecurity domestically. I don't know if you realize the face of it, but we're talking about 1 in 6 people in America, 18%. We're talking about 1 in 4 children. 25% of the kids in this country are growing up at some point in the last year where they didn't know where their next meal was. And we're talking about 36% of those people are people that have jobs. 24% of them are people that own their own homes. We're talking about half of them are in rural suburban settings, and less than 10% of them are homeless. This isn't a problem of a deinstitutionalized man or woman pushing a shopping cart down the street. This is a problem that's pervasive in our society. It may be hidden, but it's pervasive. And to Bonnie's point, it is at the core of national security and at the core of the kind of society that we build. When we think about spending $1 trillion in Iraq, what are we spending here in caring for our own core society? At any rate, we began to think about it, and we began to play with it, and we decided to take a shot, and we decided to test out building community cafes. We know how to, we open a restaurant every 2 days. We know how to do it. And we decided we'd test out these cafes where there were no set prices. The assumption was we'd have the full Panera menu. You could walk in. If you have a few extra bucks like Dan, you can leave a little bit more. If you have a little bit less, you can leave a little bit less. And if you have nothing, you can leave nothing. And you put it into a donation box so we can protect your dignity. We put it in, we give you a mechanism to do it so you feel safe. And it was amazing to me is it actually worked. I mean, many cynics said it would never work. To me, it was a test of humanity. The reality is it worked. On average, we collect about 80% of the retail price in a donation bin. And we've since opened 5 of these. We'll serve upwards of 1 million people in these this year. And I think for us, it activated us. I think as much as anything, not only did it, this isn't going to fix food insecurity, but what it did is it engaged us in activity, and it allowed us to move forward. And from there, we began to test putting a pay what you want, pay what you can menu item on our menus. It got us much more involved in feeding America. And ultimately for us, it's led us into really thinking about issues of nutrition. Because we often think about the quantity of food, but we're also thinking about we've got 8 million customers a week. What's the quality of their food? And what are they eating? And how do we think about that? And how do we do it? I think ultimately, for us, this was meant to be a challenge to our corporate friends to say, take your core skills and see if you can figure out how to add value in the society. Last comment. As a corporate leader, my perspective is we got a couple of roles in this. One, we agitate. I mean, we can raise issues. I have a platform to speak, so we can raise issues and make people think, if only to think about the depth of the problem. Secondly, we're laboratories to innovate because we have resources and we have skills and we have capabilities. But the most interesting thing to me is we change the marketplace. And I think Derek spoke to it. I mean, the reality is 10 years ago, this month, we were the first large food retailer restaurant in the country to do chicken raised without antibiotics. When we did it, the cost of the antibiotic-free chicken was nearly twice the price of the conventionally raised chicken. Today, the price of the antibiotic-free chicken has come down nearly to the level of the conventionally raised chicken. It was because we took the risk of going out into the marketplace, and we began to see the producer community respond to that. And the prices began to come down as there was scale economics that began to take hold. And I think ultimately, one of the challenges for us as corporate leaders is to take that leap of faith, is to actually go out, and I'm paid to stay ahead of the marketplace, to actually get out there and move, because the world is moving in that direction. And I think the marketplace will follow.
That's great, and that's a good segue to Josh. So, Josh, of course, here at least you are the Gates Foundation. I will not tell Bill and Melinda that I said
Please
that,
don't.
but so the Gates Foundation, as a major philanthropist and NGO, has probably been I'm not going to say the only catalyst, because you're not, but you've been a major catalyst because of basically your size and your impact and your number of relationships throughout the developing world on issues of agriculture and health development. Of course, you do a lot in the United States as well, in the education arena and everything else. So you see this whole issue of changing the world and making us more food secure and doing it sustainably and changing the nature of poverty and everything else from a holistic way, because I assume you're out working with and funding all sorts of different types of projects, and even if they're not successful, you can accept that and move on, so to speak. So from your perspective, where are we and what do we need to be doing?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So it's worth maybe backing up. When I started working at the Gates Foundation, I think for most people who know the foundation, I think we're more known for the global health work that we do. But in fact, agriculture is the largest global program at the foundation, both by staff size and by funding amount. So we come to that because agriculture, in our view, is the most effective path out of poverty, and that's what we're focused on. So we start in our program, and this will get to one of two answers to this big question that I want to provide. We start from the perspective of a smallholder farmer. And for those of us who work in this field, we know this, but the traditional portrait of a farmer is not a middle-aged man driving a tractor on a cornfield. It's a smallholder farmer who's typically a woman who's farming on a pretty small plot of land, a couple of football fields or so. And so we friends. By 2030, I will come back to why that number has extra meaning to me. By 2030, we'll only be able to feed 25% of Africa. So these things have to change. We have to empower them to grow more food. So that's the first point I'd like to make in answer to the question. The second one is, for those who know the Gates Foundation, we love data. We just can't get enough of it. Our boss can't get enough of it. Our grantees probably get tired of us asking for more of it, but we use that data to set big goals and to guide our investment framework. And I think most of us who come to this festival have a high value for data. So I want to talk, though, about the use of the data to set goals. So back in 2000, it was actually in the middle of the first campaign that I ever worked on. The world agreed to a set of goals called the Millennium Development Goals. A kind of romantic gesture at the turn of the millennium, say in the next 15 years, we want to reach a certain set of targets, reaching access for HIV prevention, treatment, care, providing treatment for malaria, universal education, et cetera. And those goals have become a scorecard for the world on their progress. And as an advocate and a policy analyst at that time, it's very easy to look at the United Nations doing this and say, this is nice, it's great to have done, it won't mean anything. What we've learned since is it's meant a lot. It mobilized civil society, mobilized the private sector, mobilized governments. At the end of the day, it was an accountability mechanism to make sure that we were moving forward. But there was a problem. There were many problems. There was a big problem for this panel in those goals. Agriculture was mentioned nowhere in that set of goals. This is a goals focused on alleviating poverty. Agriculture is arguably the strongest lever to lift people out of poverty, and they're nowhere in those goals. So we're nearing the end, the expiry date of those MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, this arcane acronym. And we're starting to set a new set of goals, and I want to go back to a place that we started, which is, so we're now calling these the Sustainable Development Goals. Those will be the targets from 2015 to 2030. And a few things, in our view, need to change, and I'm happy to report they are changing, that we have some time to get there. One is we need a much more holistic approach to who participates in these goals. So the first time around, though it's great that they happened, they were largely governments, largely donors, who were looking north to south as to how we could help the world's poor. Reflected the way the world worked, the way our institutions worked, much more then. We can't do that mostly because we wouldn't be successful, but it's also not the way that we can seek buy-in to goals and seek progress. So these Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, another horrible acronym, will be universal. Our challenges are global. There are challenges for the richest people in the richest countries and for the poorest people in the poorest countries. We can't solve a 9 billion person nourishment crisis without the smallholder farmers increasing their productivity, nutritional status. And so I'm happy to say the process so far has been much more inclusive. It can always be much more inclusive. It's also led, as you might expect, to a much more holistic approach to the answer to this question and to the goals with which we'll set. And so what we're seeing now and what the Gates Foundation, with input from many of our partners, from polling that's been done, I think the number is something akin to 30 million now, individual people around the world weighing in on these goals, which is, it's a small number compared to the world's population, but sort of an astonishing number of people who weigh on a pretty arcane acronym, UN process, et cetera, are now pushing for a whole value chain that starts with increased productivity, improved economic opportunities for smallholder farmers that will lift them out of poverty, environmental sustainability, nutritional outcomes, and overall improved livelihoods. And we're seeing that whole chain come to be is something that I think if we can get the world to agree to, it's not a silver bullet, I agree there is none, but for 15 years, for the next 15 years, we can see the same sort of focus that came to the MDGs and those issues be placed on this set of issues in a much better, much more holistic, much more solution-driven way to solving these problems. So my hope is that we will, in order to solve this problem, focus on smallholder farmers as a key lever, again, not silver bullet, and we can all come together to agree a set of goals that will in a holistic way drive our investments and our partnerships across all the different pieces of this sector together.
So I'm going to go back this way, and when you talk about the goals and you talk about complexity and smallholder farmers, and and we talked a little bit before, just raising from doubling or tripling yields can be done just with fairly just traditional agriculture techniques. But Time Magazine had a story this week, and I want to come back on the issue of technology. So they had a story that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was funding a research effort to deal with a much more nutritious banana. Most bananas have some minerals, but they don't have a lot of vitamins, as I understand it. And so you get potassium and magnesium, but not much vitamin A and other things. So you've been funding a study or research project that will, in fact, use genetic engineering or biotechnology to produce a banana that has meat inside of it that is enriched and higher vitamin A content, which millions and millions of people in the developing world don't get enough of. We know that's not the only solution to the problem, but when we talk about these issues worldwide of feeding a hungry world, this issue of technology, biotechnology, GMOs, and everything else just kind of dominates the conversation. And I wonder if you might speak to how Gates views this issue of technology and biotechnology.
Sure.
And then I want to go around the room and have people see what they think about it.
We never get this question, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So I'd like to start out with two quick macro points, and then I'll answer the specific thing. One, as you know, and we talk about often, we work with Dan a lot, technology in this field, we need a whole range of technology. Farmer access to mobile technology for commodity pricing, for weather data, et cetera, e-wallets to save, et cetera. There's a whole range of technology we need. And so often the conversation gets focused on this one piece, and that's natural, it's a debated topic, but I just want to start there. And second, in most of the conversations that I do on this, and most of my colleagues, some of which are here, there's a tendency that we end up talking about GM technology, genetically modified foods, for the whole conversation. And I want to point out, I think this story is a good one, because it illustrates why GM technology is a single tool that offers farmers options to solve a specific problem in this field. It's not the debate that we're trying to have and often get into is not about GM or not. It's about solving problems that farmers need to solve in order to have nutritious food and enough of it. So on the super banana, as it is called, the way we come to this, in Uganda, one of the focus countries the Gates Foundation works in, bananas are 1/5 of the caloric intake. They're 50% of the land under cultivation for farming in Uganda. 52% of Ugandans are vitamin A deficient and 81% are iron deficient. So that defines the challenge in Uganda as well as the opportunity if you can enrich this, this food, bananas. So the current banana that is consumed in Uganda is largely deficient in those nutrients. And so the National Research Organization, Agricultural Research Organization called NERU in Uganda has been leading a set of research studies to fortify this banana, and they've been working with a range of institutions around the world. But it is, as often criticized, so to say, this is a Ugandan-driven solution by farmers, agricultural research scientists in Uganda that we're supporting directly through, or we're supporting NERU to do this. So the recent story has been in the trials so far, they've shown highly enriched vitamin A, vitamin K, iron levels in these bananas, and now we're moving into field and human trials soon. An interesting end to that story, and then I'll stop, is that in Uganda right now they allow research on GM, but there's been massive intervention from outside of Uganda, as well as some from in Uganda, that it will prevent the introduction of this banana in Uganda. And so in our view, this is an option for farmers, and the Ugandan government and its people need to decide what to do here. But it's something that when we have this discussion of technology, our view on this is farmers and the citizens of these countries should decide their policies. And what we're seeing right now is a much more US and European-driven debate in Uganda about Ugandans' choices. And so our hope is this is one product of many, many that are not GM. But we have some technology barriers that are research, and we have some that are policy. And we need cohesive solutions that are driven nationally.
Okay, yeah, Ron?
I just add a slightly different perspective on GMOs, and that is that this is a red-hot political issue, as you all appreciate. I mean, it's intense. The one thing that we can all agree on, I believe, is that we need to have clear labeling. And the point is so people can make a choice.
Well, I'm not sure that we can all agree on that.
You wouldn't even agree to
I'm not speaking for anybody here, but that's also a subject of serious discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you know.
Because we live in a world where we cannot even trace it and don't know what we're actually serving all the way through the supply chain. And you have intense political pressure on retailers like us to actually take a position on it. And we can't because we don't know what we have.
So Derek, you're the scientist, the nutritionist here.
I just want to give two observations I made over the last few years where I had a feeling I was looking at the future, and one example of looking at the past. So the two examples of the future, one you may know is the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Jeddah. You can say, what on earth are they doing in Jeddah? Well, they have realized long term that much of the discussion on agriculture has ignored the sea, the marine environment. So they're investing
the ocean. Yeah.
The oceans. More water on the planet than there's land. And we are not investing in virtually anything to do with aquatic plants. Obviously, fisheries people are looking at. And you go down to Jeddah and you'll see the cutting edge of science in the Red Sea, starting to look at what is going to be the future of aquatic plants, which are great sources of the right balance of potassium and sodium, and many of the other nutrients that we need. And I mention it because how that's going to get commercialized is going to be a big question. And that's where private-public partnerships are needed. The second is, you've got to be balanced in the Middle East, is at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, where between the Weizmann Institute and what's happening in Rehovot, they're not talking about the future. They have now looked at a mixture of classic better approaches to plant breeding as well as some of the GM work, not just to look at nutrient enhancement, but environmental resilience for drought-prone countries, longer shelf life to address the waste issues I spoke about, and enhanced taste in the more nutrient-enhanced products to ensure that consumer needs are addressed. And I think the sense of what I get out of what is happening there is that the technology capabilities in both those places are showing there is a way forward to address some of these needs. The big stumbling block is going to be perception of risk. And we have done very badly in letting people understand what is true risk and what is theoretical risk. And the area of food, because anything you take into your body, people land up being most fearful of, as opposed to whether it's in other forms of materials. And I really hope that we actually get on top of this issue quicker than we are doing now, because otherwise it could very well cut off at the knees the extraordinary advances. And then the negative side, which is not in the technology, there are some areas in agriculture which should be extremely limited, constrained, and condemned. One is palm oil production. Palm oil is destroying the rainforests at a rate that one cannot believe. It's bad for the environment, it's bad for species, and it's bad for cardiovascular health. Yet the discussion around it, even in this country, is virtually mute, whereas the discussion on some marginal impact on health is extremely high.
Yeah,
So
Toni?
I'd like to touch on a couple of comments that our colleagues have made. First of all, my sense of, and I think, Josh, you laid out very well the next iteration of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I agree with you completely that it's been a much more inclusive approach in terms of identifying those goals. But I'd like to suggest that our multilateral institutions and the UN structure, as it lays out these new policy frameworks, are organized in a 20th century approach and looking at 21st century issues. And we have to really be accepting of that and drive to a new paradigm and really look at new organizational structures that actually lash up the health agencies with the agricultural agencies, and most importantly, the ministries of finance. So I want to be very Dan and I speak quite often about being pragmatic and practical, and we talk about smallholder farmers and establishing this ecosystem. We need to assemble a practical toolbox. What are the incentives for public-private partnerships? How do you reach a common agenda that helps have a clear pathway? So you're going to look at a September UN convening that moves to an October World Bank convening. Nothing's going to change. It will be the exact same. Ministers of finance will continue to meet. The UN will have they'll lay out the Sustainable Development Goals. We have an opportunity. We need to use technology to lash up information. You touched on, how you support smallholder farmers in situ. I would argue in Uganda, we need to do, and elsewhere, a better job of mobilizing using technology to mobilize social network platforms to help educate and create communities of interest. We've seen what it'll do at a Tahrir Square, but we've also seen that that organizational structure doesn't carry forward in terms of actual execution. So I think our task is to think about how do we create these common areas of interest that can help reach a consensus in a Uganda. Are they going to accept this new idea? How is it going to be incentivized? And so that they are empowered. And I think that we still have a disconnect on that front.
Okay, so Bonnie, you're on the ground. You heard what everybody said, but particularly Josh, what he talked about in terms of new technologies. What's GAIN's position on all this stuff?
Well, I have to, on the ground is an important perspective.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of new technologies, and I'm coming, for those who don't know, I've come from the CGIAR, the Green Revolution Institutes, and I'm an agronomist from background, and we developed a lot of new technologies. I was one of the directors of Harvest Plus, which is a biofortification program. But in fact, coming to GAIN, there's this very clear insight that you are a long way from that baby's mouth just because you have a new technology. And the innovations are all along the supply chain, but it's understanding the demand side. What are the constraints of mothers for feeding her child?
Yeah.
And we at GAIN, we do a lot of work in applying a focused ethnographic surveys, going into communities, understanding women's constraints to feeding their babies. And in particular in farming communities, she has a time famine. She's spending time gathering wood, she's spending time gathering water. And so really the trigger for nutrition may come from very unusual places. It may be in cook stoves. Now one wouldn't think of a cook stove as a nutrition intervention necessarily, but you need to understand the demand side because these solutions are going to be pulled And just like you're facing that whole demand question from your consumers, it's no different. These moms need to have the solutions that they request. And you brought this up this morning, right? It's if they build it, they will come. No, in fact, they will demand. We have to look at that demand question.
Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions, and I know there are some here. We have 5 panelists, and not everybody has to answer the question. You may have it for a specific person or not, but we have mics, and so if you would just identify yourself. This gentleman right here with this hand up. Just before you start, I'll just tell you how complicated it is. I went to Guatemala on a CARE Cargill mission, and the rate of stunting in Guatemala is perhaps the highest in the world, or it's one of the highest in the world per capita. And what we found is that one of the causes of stunting, not the only cause, was the fact that historically such impure sanitation procedures have produced a water supply that provides permanent parasites in the intestines of these kids. So they may be getting a pretty fair diet, but they can't absorb any of the food that they have. It's just, it's one complexity on this whole situation. Yes, sir, back there.
Hi, I'm David Kirkpatrick. I'm a technology journalist and a conference organizer. And a couple things sort of percolated in my mind, but Derek was talking about you really do have an impact as a consumer when you choose what to buy. That's interesting. One of the things that is overwhelmingly popular in Aspen and increasingly in the country is organic food. And I was partly reminded of this when Ron was saying the thing you did with antibiotic-free chicken, and then thinking what Walmart just did with organic food. So I guess 2 things. One, what do you all think of this organic food movement? Is that a good thing? For for the issues we're describing, because I know there's different opinions on that. And second of all, just specifically, Ron, I'd love your opinion on what Walmart has done.
Okay.
On organics.
So organics, good, bad, wonderful?
I think, very frankly, in this personal position, I think it depends on what the food you're eating is, right? So if you're taking an apple that's covered in pesticide, then you want to have organics. If you have something that is coming through a very different kind of processing thing, it may be less important. And I think it all depends. And I'm talking about from a consumer perspective. To the broader question of Walmart moving into organics, that's exactly what we want. I mean, that is the manifestation of what we're saying. You begin to see change, and it begins, somebody was saying, begins with one stone can turn a river. And you begin to have that evolution, and you begin to have that demand cycle. And small and medium companies pick it up. We're the guys that take the risk. We'll take the leap of faith. And you got guys like Walmart that follow us. And ultimately, you end up with the whole demand side of it changing. And that's what we want. So I think it's a great thing.
Okay, so will organics help feed a hungry population in sub-Saharan Africa?
So I think we need to, it's a question of where we are today and what problems we're trying to solve today. And so I come from a limited perspective in this discussion, and the way we identify what crops and the way we get them are 2 things. One, what food do people eat now, and what are farmers growing, and what are they demanding? And so that's the way our trigger response. It isn't organic or traditional or hybrid or GM or SPAN. It's trying to react to the demands of consumers who are buying in poor countries, and in many cases, subsistence farmers who are growing themselves or families, and hopefully soon for a market. So we tend to approach it from the perspective we come from, not in an either or in a blunt way, but in a reactionary way to what we're being asked to do.
Derek, you must have some thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I liked your answer, which is a sort of maybe type answer. I'm also reminded of what colleagues tell me in Africa, and I'm from South Africa all the time, is that if you really want to see organic agriculture, go to Africa. 1 ton per hectare is what you get on organic agriculture in Africa. That's a little bit chilling to think about.
And how much do they need to grow? Would you say, if you were projecting what they ought to be growing in a more...
Well, I think you could say at least doubling or tripling those yields to reasonable levels.
Yeah. Our projection is you need to double now in order to feed the population by 2030.
So it's kind of, in a sense, different strokes for different folks. I mean, organic in the United States, where we have an abundant food supply, has become a very fast-growing part of agriculture. But it may not be suitable for all parts of the world. I think is that kind of the general message?
I just would like to add that what we constantly crash into in trying to diversify diets is the affordability of these nutritious foods. And our big challenge is bringing down the price of the non-staples. And as you know, Dan, we've invested in maize, wheat, corn. Maize, wheat, cassava in the developing world, plus rice and a bit of soy is probably the big five, right? And in the case of the United States, cotton. But for consumables, we have not invested in those non-perishables. Those are the nutritionally dense foods. The CGIAR was started with rice, maize, wheat, and they did a tremendous job in increasing yields.
Sounds like American farm policy.
It sounds like.
Yeah.
But we have not proportionally invested in the non-staples, the pulses, those that are quite rich in micronutrients.
Yeah.
Dan, let me suggest,
Sure.
I think we need to incentivize that change. We need to learn from these best practices on the ground. And I'm not sure we're seeing that shifting.
Yeah.
We're just continuing to talk about it, but not act on different models.
Okay, let's see. If we have a few questions, I may ask people just to ask them one at a seriatim so we can get everything asked. So let's go back there.
Hi, I work in Detroit. I coordinate a network of 1,500 gardens and farms. I'm a big fan of Jason Clay's work in the WWF strategy related to feeding 9 billion people. One of the strategic things that they've pulled out is urban agriculture. I haven't heard anybody talk about growing food in cities and its power to reestablish people's connection to food. And I'd like to hear what the panelists have to say.
Anybody want to comment on urban agriculture or ex-urban agriculture? Maybe not just be in cities, but maybe in suburban areas around cities. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
can have a quick. I think it's great to get food as close to people as possible, and we know urbanization is going to be, it's the trend. I mean, people are moving to cities all over. I do have one concern, and I want us to watch it. I think we have to be very careful of the toxicity and bringing in leads and things. We have to be very careful of those heavy metals in an urban setting to be growing food. But other than that, I think that it's a great movement.
Let's see, I saw another hand up. Let's go right up here. Jerry Hagstrom. Orange shirt.
Yes, I'm wondering if the rest of the panel shares the concern about meat and poultry that the gentleman in the middle mentioned, because in most of the developing world, there is a desire to have more meat consumption, especially in the growing affluence of China, India, etc. So do you think is it bad for them to eat more meat?
Let's see, Derek, you raised that issue, I think.
I was talking particularly about beef. Yes.
Okay.
It's bad for the planet and bad for
do others hold that view?
I'm surprised you'd say that, Derek, coming from the World Health Organization.
Josh, I wonder
we need
if
iron. We need iron in the diet.
you have a
other
different
sources of
more
iron.
view or a nuanced view on this?
Yeah, it's about nuance, right? So the foundation's just moved to increase our investments in livestock to 20% of the overall budget. That's more than a doubling of our focus. So we're also focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, making feed more sustainable in the way we produce it, different types of feed that build on staple crops that are locally produced, et cetera. And so it's that nuance that is, does it contribute to dietary diversity, and will it help solve some of the nutritional problems we have? Yes. Does it have environmental impacts? Yes. Are there ways that we're trying to reduce those? Yes. And so I think you have to, we would say you have to look at all the pieces of that chain in order to answer that question from a nuanced perspective.
Okay. Let's see, there was another hand right up here.
Hi, I'm Maura O'Neill. I was the Chief Innovation Officer at USAID, and so proud of the administration's focus on Feed the Future. But to Toni's point, and I'd be interested in the rest of hers and the rest of the panelists' view, the American public gets that as a humanitarian, but they don't fully understand the national security imperative of food security globally. Any advice on how we can have that conversation with the American public, that they get it in the way that they get, well, at least they used to get the military budgets?
So, Maura, I think that, thank you for your question, and I very much valued working with you. I think Feed the Future has been an extraordinary effort, and it needs to be leveraged as a best practice that is not just, that can be expanded. And let me take the positive note. With regard to your question on the issue of how can we look at this issue of food security as a national security issue, It's about messaging and communicating. It's about bringing our DoD infrastructure into as a stakeholder. I don't want to get too specific, but I think there was an opportunity which we missed to have a merged national security budget, an 050-150 budget. And we are constantly looking at the trade-offs of development assistance and State Department traditional diplomacy assistance against a DoD budget, which in today's reality, in terms of today's budget framework, is being reduced. But that really isn't the whole picture. We need to look at these issues in their totality and the whole picture. I think it could help build a consensus with a dysfunctional Congress, and you have to bring them to the table. But
I resent that. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, but I think we really do need to bring the stakeholders to the table and to communicate at the highest levels of our government.
I would just say, I'm going to call on Josh and Bonnie, but I would say that parenthetically, we've had a transformational change in USAID in the last 5 years. And America's role in the world and development of assistance and trying to build self-sustaining, resilient societies is, I don't think I've seen anything like it since the Marshall Plan when I was only 4 years old then. But, you know, and other efforts where we've had the kind of talent focusing on these issues and highlighting food security, so it's now on the agendas of big leaders of major countries. They're talking about it. 30 years ago, nobody could spell the word food. They would just have dinners after their meetings when they were talking about everything else. So I do think we've highlighted the issue. We make it remarkably more interesting to talk about and important. Josh and then Bonnie.
So I just want to maybe not push back, but challenge the audiences that we talk to on this. So the outcome, we all would agree on. These investments in our food security are critical.
Okay.
I'd look at a conversation in DC and then out of DC. And I used to work for a campaigning group that's one of their aims was to support Feed the Future and other such programs. And polling overwhelmingly and repeatedly for years said the national security argument was not terribly effective with the American public. In Washington, having DoD officials, State Department officials talk to Congress about the security implications, foreign leaders, of these investments and the importance of them for stability, security, very critical, definitely works. With the American public, by a margin of 83% to somewhere in the 50s, the last that I saw, a morality-based argument and a global food, global hunger argument pulled at the heartstrings for the American public to invest much more in the national security dimension. So it's all to say it's not an either or. Just as we think about audiences, this will become critical. We're in a constrained, not become.
Yeah.
We are in a constrained budget environment, and I think we need to let data
Quick
drive
response,
this.
Toni, and then we'll
Quick,
end with-
I think it must not become an either or. I think we need a moral chapeau that is appropriate, but I don't think that we should ever look at the national security approach as being linear and bifurcated, and it needs to be merged, and that would make a compelling argument.
By the way, the most effective thing when we poll is to show that we know how to do this. And that's not only a donor conversation, it's a global food system conversation, but the more we talk about success stories that are driven by different countries, driven by donors, driven by others coming together in these partnerships, that's what leads to people believing we can do
I
this.
suspect we need more of that in domestic issues as well, so that people would have confidence that their government works and they would have trust in it. The economic argument also is important for American companies and American business interests to see that it's in their interest. I mean, after all, Africa is a continent of what, 1 billion people? I mean, it's 30 years from now, it may be enormously important in terms of trade and other kinds of things. Bonnie.
Is this my last opportunity?
It may be
to
your
say
last
things?
opportunity
Okay.
because we're out of time. So.
I'll start with Feed the Future. It has been transformative. And I say that having worked in agriculture. I sat in an agriculture institute bringing in nutrition. I'm now in a nutrition organization bringing in agriculture. And it always fell between the cracks. You present a nutritious food and they say, oh, you know what, that's an ag project. Or they say, oh, that's a nutrition project. Feed the Future has connected agriculture with health and the private sector, which is a really very, very interesting and transformative connection. And I applaud Feed the Future. It's not easy. We don't have the indicators, but we're pushing the envelope of how to measure this stuff and what is success. My final point is, I've come here to Aspen, and I mostly spend my time in Africa and Asia. And I am so impressed with the brain power, the innovation, the leadership and advocacy. And my plea is that we use all of this to transform the food system. And I would argue, let's do a spotlight on the global food system. There's a huge challenge we're facing. And the tsunami of obesity, along with undernutrition, we need all your innovations, all your brains, all your investments. And as you say, the philanthropists of the world, the businesses of the world have the freedom to innovate and help us innovate on this very challenging issue.
Yeah, well, look, it's like how to talk about from the beginning to the end of the world in 1 hour and then get something out of it. This is such a massive subject, and it's so complicated, but I think that we've shown the richness of the thinking here. And I think that's the most important thing, and the importance of the subject. And I think it was John Maynard Keynes who said, for every complicated problem, there is a simple and a wrong solution. And I think too often we look at this issue of food and we say it's my way or the highway, or it's organic versus traditional, or it's GMO versus non-GMO. And in the nutrition world, of course, every day we're changing our views on what's good for you and what isn't good for you. And that adds a lot of confusion out there. But the importance of this subject is just extraordinary. And also the relationship between agriculture, poverty, health, and nutrition. I'll never forget that my mother used to say, take your medicine with food. And we're finding that, in fact, in Africa, the AIDS epidemic was somewhat restricted by the lack of nutritional strength of people. And when they combined the two, they had a lot more ability to tackle the disease. And so food, agriculture, health, and development, and fighting poverty are integral to solving these problems over the long term. So panel's done a great job. Give them a hand for everything they've done here.